Okay, well, my name's Guy Stephen Needler, and I like to use the term spiritual physicist and against using the term metaphysicist, because I believe that spiritual physics is a progression beyond metaphysics, and that's why I like to use that name, spiritual physicist. It's a progression beyond, because the information I'm picking up in my books, the channeled information, is actually above and beyond the usual genre of information that I've been seeing in previous books and new books as well. Well, I started out in this field probably a long time ago, actually. If I was to give you my life history in a nutshell, I was really involved in metaphysics and supernatural and spiritual information from the age of 4, which is like 49 years ago. And I started to meditate and find information about information through seeking books that were useful to me. And one particular morning I was doing meditation, I was visited by 4 individuals who suddenly appeared in my peripheral vision, and they were humanoid, and they had white robes on, and they told me that what I was experiencing was right, what I was researching into right, because I was really ahead of my time with books and things, because when I was a child, most of the kids were looking at comics and you know, like the Beano and the Dandy in the UK, and I was looking at more important things like books on supernatural information and spiritual information, and of course UFOs as well, which is all part of the whole genre. It's just a different type of genre. And they said what you were doing was right, and what you were researching into was right, but it was the wrong time. I needed to get more earthly information. And so basically how can I say it, really automatically stepped back from what I was doing, and it became like somebody turned a switch off. I was still interested, I kept one eye open on spiritual matters, on scientific matters, but it was nowhere near as intense as it was in my early years. And so I became the average person, average materialistic person actually. I strove to get better and higher in the structure within the business I was working within, my career. I became middle management. I met my beautiful wife, and we got a house, and we worked very hard on that to get it into not just a livable condition, because we bought an old country cottage, but to making it what Anne liked to have as her idea of the perfect country cottage. And I went and regained a level of academic level that was consistent with my career path. So I became a chartered engineer, European engineer, gained 2 master's degrees. So I really was the antithesis of the materialistic individual within the world, and I was ambitious with this as well. And then one year, sort of the end of the 1990s, one of the ladies who was on my first master's degree, who we stayed in contact with, she said, "I'm going to do a course on Reiki, are you interested?" And I said no, wasn't interested at first. But after she asked me about 3 or 4 times, I thought, well, okay, I'll have a look. 12 months later, I popped out with a Reiki Master Certificate. And I started to get involved with another lady who was one of my energy healers, because I was going through a particularly difficult patch in one of my master's degrees. The maths involved was horrendous. It wasn't invented when I was at school, so I was having to learn how to use this maths and manipulate it for different pieces of work I had to do as part of the degree. So I was getting a bit stressed out. So I went to see this lady, and she helped me. And one day she said, "I'm going to do a course, an introductory course based upon the work that Barbara Brennan taught her." Now, Barbara Brennan's quite a leading light in terms of energy healing. She was a NASA scientist in her own right. And she introduced a very structured engineering-based way to learn how to do energy healing. So I went on this first weekend and signed up for probably a 4.5-year commitment actually, which involves serious levels of psychoanalysis of the self. We had to go into psychotherapy, so we didn't pass on our own baggage to others. And so I did that. Almost at the same time, because there was a number of things happening at the same time, another friend of mine who was into Reiki went to work for a motor car company in Sweden, and he said to my wife and I, do I want to go and have a weekend's holiday or a 5-day holiday with him, because he lived close to a very nice little town, and there was lots of countryside there. And we said, okay, we'll go there. So we went. what I didn't realise at the time, his Reiki master, because he was also into Reiki, said that you've got to get Guy to a certain place because there's something important going to happen. Well, we went on a countryside walk, and during this countryside walk, it led us down a path to a riverside walk. And on this riverside walk, I started to feel the energies build up, and my hands started to tingle, then my arms started to tingle, my whole body started to tingle. And I felt an intense need to meditate. And I found a rock, a little islandlet, as it were, just off this walk, and I sat down and meditated there. And I received in the next 25 minutes what I can only describe as the most profound attunement I've ever received in my life. And my friend and my wife went further up the river and went to a suspension bridge where you can swap from one side of the river to the other side. And they said at the time I was sitting there meditating, they felt there was craft had come through some sort of dimensional or frequential portal, and they were hovering over me, and that they felt that I was being rewired for something later. Well, when they came back, they saw me get up and start to scratch my head as to what was going on with me, because I was struggling to get sentences together in my own mind, let alone speak them to my friend and my wife when they came back. I was starting to experience different things around me, and it was a completely airless day. There was no wind, but across the other side of the river, I noticed that the trees were moving backwards and forwards, and that the local river was really choppy. The water was really choppy, lots of waves. And as I looked harder to see what was happening, I started to pick out the outline of some really strange looking craft. I can only describe them as craft because they appeared to be metallic, but they weren't as what we would classify as the archetypical flying saucer, for instance. They were something completely different. And they looked like they were upside down cones with the tentacles of an octopus or a squid. And they appeared to be shielded, or shall I say, cloaked in some way. I could see the outline, and it appeared to be a very three-dimensional outline over the backdrop of these trees and the river. And as I looked harder, I could see more detail. And all of a sudden, I had this rather quite large and loud voice in my head say, "Don't undo what we've just done. You'll spoil it. Just give it time to integrate with you. It'll take some time." So I then backed off, and this image went away. But it was interesting that from that point onwards, things started to happen. And in the energy healing, I found out I was going to levels much higher than I was being taught. And my energy healing teacher told me off several times for going higher than the class. She didn't know where I was going, but the students that I was working with, because we all shared healing with each other, we were one day we were healed, next day we were the healer. But I was taking these people to levels and places that I didn't know where I was going to, and certainly they didn't know where they were going to, and they were getting a little bit freaked out as a result of that. So I resolved to back off and behave myself and do what I was taught in the class. Outside of the class, I resolved to work out what was actually happening and tried to get to these places on a robust basis. And I developed a system over a period of time that allowed me to count my way up what were frequency levels associated with the environment that I was working within. And I started to get in contact with other entities and other beings, and which included aliens, other incarnate beings of higher frequency, because we can't see them with the physical eye because they're higher frequency than us. But I started to get in contact with those in different parts of the world, including I had to go back to Sweden, where this attunement was, for 5 years in the trot to get little recalibrations and top-ups. And I started to get information about the greater reality as a result of that. Not only the physical universe, but the multiversal environments as well. And during that, I got in contact with various different entities and different physical entities that are of a higher frequency, and gained information. And as I was able to go higher and higher, I got in contact with different entities. Some of them helped me. Some of them gave me guides to get me higher as well. And I eventually made contact with much larger entities. One of them included a set of entities that are part of the resonant frequency of the background energies associated with the multiversal environment. And then another bigger entity eventually described itself as our source, what you could classify as God if you wanted to, but all the entities I was communicating with called it the source entity, not God, the source entity. And I gained a lot of information from that entity as well. And then I was then later introduced to another much bigger entity that classified itself as the origin, that entity that has created everything, that created our source to allow, and other source entities, and gave them purpose basically to be. And their role here is to, as is our role, because we are created by our source, to accelerate its purpose, which is basically to experience, learn, and evolve. And all of the entities within the physical universe and all of the entities within the multiverse are here to experience, learn, and evolve in all sorts of different ways. And there's no rules, we just got to go and do it. And part of that is being involved in an environment which is so low frequency that the only way we can experience it properly is to be within a vehicle that allows us to experience the lower frequencies in the way they're supposed to be. And that's how I became what I am now. The thing was, though, I started to write all of this down. I started to journal it. And at a certain point, around about 2005, 2006, I started to realise I got enough material for a book. And that first book became The History of God. And there's more books that have followed since. There's been the Beyond the Source Book 1, Beyond the Source Book 2, which talks about me being in contact with the other source entities, because there was 12 source entities created by the origin to help it experience, learn, and evolve faster. And so I've gained some insights about their environments and how their creations are helping them evolve as well. And I've also written a book about karma, which came out as a result of a series of blogs. And I suddenly realised that this information should be broadcast as a way to avoid karma and allow ourselves to eradicate our karma in a single lifetime, should we be dedicated enough to do so, and therefore remove the need to incarnate. And there's another book just recently been accepted as well called The Origin Speaks, which is all about the information from the origin as well. And there's more books to come. There's lots and lots to come. And that's my history in a nutshell. Well, the entities I first got in contact with were basically frequential entities. They were energetic entities rather than being what we call physical entities. The first one I contacted on what I would classify as the 27th frequency level, which is in another dimensional condition to where we are right now. And that tried to scare me off at first, because it thought, well, you're an incarnate human being, you shouldn't be here. And it looked into my memory, and it looked at what it thought would scare me. So it gave me like a black dragon type of entity. And I actually called it the dragon entity for a number of months actually. And every time I went to this level, projected my consciousness to this level, it tried to scare me off. But eventually, after 3 or 4 months, it thought, well, perhaps you should be here. And it started to capitulate and gave me information. I started to enter into a daily dialogue with it. And I got a lot of information from that particular entity, specifically about the fact that we can't use the word time anymore. It should be events. We live in event space, a series of events that work together, that are either localized events as we create them, or they're collective events. For instance, within this environment here has 2 local event spaces, your event space and my event space. And then there's the wider event space to do with the local environment that we're in, that's part of this hotel, for instance, and all these little collective event spaces making a bigger event space. So I got information about space and how we exist, and how events and event space creates parallelism within a rigid structure of the multiverse, and how all these different parallel conditions can fractally expand and contract based upon us having choices to make. We have a choice to go here or there, or the possibility of a choice, or the possible possibility of a choice, or the possible possibility of a possible possibility. And all these spaces can expand and contract as a result of that. So I gained a lot of information from that particular entity. When I was going on holiday in Greece, I managed to get in contact with other entities there as well. And I still go to this place and I meditate on the roof. And one day I was meditating on the roof and I noticed I was being observed, or that there was activity happening. So I used my perceptual vision and I noticed that on the mountainside around where I was staying, there was bases. and there was craft or constructs coming and going, and I thought, what are these guys doing here? So I zoomed over to them with my thought process and my perceptual vision, and I asked them what they were doing there, and they said, "Oh, you can see us, can you?" I said, "Well, I can perceive you, yes." And I said, "Oh, okay. Well, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I'm on holiday." Something, really quite a mundane answer, really. And I said, "Okay." I said, "Well, what are you doing here then?" And I said, "Well, we're here to observe the local population." And it was quite an interesting conversation, because they were really here to see the duality, really quite a dichotomy that happened in a single generation, where the older Greeks were working with the land and the animals and the biorhythms of the earth and nature. Everything had its order and everything was in harmony. And literally within the space of one generation, their children had become very materialistic. They wanted bars and tavernas and hotels and Mercedes-Benz cars and Armani clothes and Gucci watches and all this sort of stuff. And they were really interested in how this thought process could go from being harmonious to being disharmonious in the space of literally what we call 25 years as a lifetime, And it was amazing how they were really quite interested in this, and they were waiting. They were saying, "This must take the opposite swing." So we're waiting for the opposite swing, because this can't survive. You can progress energetically, you can progress from a material world perspective, but you have to come back into harmony with what's happening around you, with the energies around you. This level of existence can't survive. You have to swing back, and so they were waiting for the swing back into the harmonious, whilst also benefiting from what they'd worked with and what they gained themselves from this material perspective as well. And so that's one of the sets of those entities, the aliens in Crete and this other entity that eventually called itself Byron. And there's many other entities associated with the wider environment that exists within the ultimate creator, the origins area of sentient self-awareness, or polyomniscient sentient self-awareness, as I've been told to call it now. And those entities are doing things in different ways. Some of them are collectives, some of them are acting like massive multiversally computing environments to try and work out how to work with synergy and how to work and overcome the synergetic barrier that can happen. Other entities are working with the very state of beingness that can happen when you're working within and without different dimensional conditions. And you can exist as an entity within another entity, which is existing within another entity, which exists as part of the universal structure of another entity. And so there's lots of convoluted conditions that these entities are existing within to experience the various different states of beingness that can be within the environments that is within their source entities created environments, which is also part of the environment that those source entities have been placed within. That's part of the overall structure of currently understood volume of structural energies and beingness that the origin, the absolute as the Hindus call it, is using within its own environment as well. And actually the origin doesn't understand how big it is. And that's one of the reasons why I've wrote and have been allowed to write a dialogue with the origin called The Origin Speaks, which my publisher, Ozark Mountain Publishing, have just recently given me the contract for. So that should come out in February 2015. So the origin is the ultimate entity, basically. It is a vast tract, a vast unfathomably large tract. It doesn't understand how big it is itself. It's still investigating itself. Of sentient energy, which gained its sentience in a very small sense at first. It became, shall I say, energy that gained a level of rudimentary intelligence, and that intelligence started to realise that if it clubbed together with other energies, it became a bigger intelligence, and then those clumps of energies came together again and created bigger clubs of energies and became much more intelligent energies, and then it became sort of self-aware rather than just being rudimentary intelligence. And then it became conscious of its self-awareness, then it became sentient. And then it started to try and investigate itself. which it did on its own at first, but realised this was quite slow. And so it created various different strategies for accelerating that ability to experience itself. Whilst it was experiencing itself and literally experimenting with its own energies, it realised it was learning things. But more interestingly, it discovered something else, something called evolution, which is well beyond what we recognise as being evolution, by the way. But it started to desire this evolutionary content that it was gathering, because it gave it much more than knowledge and wisdom and power and understanding. It was something completely different. And it tried to accelerate this. And it actually tried to recreate 12 versions of itself and place them outside of its own sphere of self-awareness of self, and gave them all the conditions that it had. But that failed. And it failed because how can that which is so big it can't understand itself recreate that which it is within itself? It can't. It completely failed. For a number of different reasons. There's individual reasons for each of these different smaller origins failing, and a much bigger reason, and that much bigger reason is it can't recreate itself within itself. There's only one origin. There can only ever be one origin. And if you want to, that's a limitation. And so it regathered those energies and decided it would create 12 lesser beings and put them within an area within itself, and said, you know, I'm going to let you become sentient in your own time and your own right. But when you do, I'm going to educate you. I'm going to give you my knowledge and also give you a state of beingness, a reason to be here. And that reason to be here is to experience, learn and evolve in any way you can, and pass that evolutionary content on to me. You don't lose it yourself, but I get it automatically. And one of those entities, one of those source entities, what I now call Source Entity 1, only because it's the first source entity I got in contact with, no other reason, decided that the way it would experience, learn and evolve would be to make a multiversal structure within itself, that's a structure that is evolution in action. We would work through it and then populate it with countless billions of smaller versions of itself to allow it to experience, learn and evolve in a rapid rate. Because as we experience, learn and evolve, so does our source entity, and so does clearly the origin. And all of this evolution and all this understanding and learning is experienced by all of the other source entities at the same time. So they're experiencing as we're experiencing as well. And really that's the whole part of it. The origin is something that's infinitesimally large. And you know, a few years ago, a friend of mine loaned me a couple of books, very old books, out of print books, that were written by a chap called, I think I'm going to get this name right, Yogi Ramachakara. And he was in Chicago back in the early 1900s, late 1800s. And he gave me this book. And I don't read books these days because I don't like to think that I could have my subconscious storing somebody else's work and then regurgitating it later. And I opened my page to just one of these books, and it described the origin. The Hindu Vedas and the yogis understood the origin before I was allowed to call it the origin. It's not new news, it's just new old news, and we're having to give it a different description to suit our modern understanding, our modern sciences and that sort of stuff. So I was really pleased that the information I was picking up independently was already known, but it disappeared because it was no longer being looked at. I mean, when I do workshops in India, they're trying as hard as they can to become westernized, and they're missing their heritage, which is a real shame. But they're getting it back again. They're starting to understand that there are people like myself and other people who are tapping into that vast wealth of knowledge and are dedicating themselves to teaching people as well. And part of that was the origin, understanding that ultimately there's another being there which is still investigating itself. And the words I was told to use is, it doesn't know 1/10 of 1% of itself. Nowhere near it. So, in terms of me meeting the source and the origin, it became a gradual thing actually, where when I started to work with the frequencies and started to map out a structure that I could work with and repeatedly go back to, and develop a visualization method that would allow me to do that, I started to realise that there's this bigger entity that was there that was communicating with me. And actually, initially, it came through as like my higher self, because my higher self was one of those aspects of me that I was communicating with that was beyond the other entities, beyond the aliens and beyond the character called Byron, who initially announced itself as being a dragon to try and scare me off. And so I communicated with my higher self for some time, but I recognised that that part of me that I was communicating with was connected to something else. And so I followed that line up. I went higher and higher and higher. And as I became able to go higher and higher, I noticed I got inertia, right? Almost like frequential inertia. And I went to a point where I actually broke through a number of different levels all at the same time. Like I went from, say, I can't remember now, level 40, frequency level 40, which I was starting to realise had a multiversal structure to it. It's part of something that was being created. I went up to like 67. And I thought, how did I get here? Because I asked where I was, and he was like, you're up to this 67th level. I thought, wow. And then I started to realise there was another entity there, a much bigger entity. And I said, who are you? And he said, I'm what you would call a source entity, what you would call your source. And so I started a dialogue with that. And initially, it said it was actually a smaller part of it, an aspect of it. And then as I got used to going there day in, every day out, day in, day out, every day I'd go for a meditation in the mornings before I went to work, it said, okay, now I can give you a bit more of myself, and a bit more of myself, and a bit more of myself. And then I started to really feel the energies associated with this thing. But not only that, I started to notice that there was this connectedness, that actually I was it and it was me, and that everything else was it and it was me. So all the trees in my garden, for instance, and the cars moving up and down the roads, and the people I worked with became me, as did the planets, the galaxies, the universe, and part of the multiversal structure. So it was really a case of, not only was I communicating with individualized entities anymore, but actually they were aspects of a bigger entity. They were aspects of a much bigger individualized piece of sentience. But that sentience had created us. But although it had given us individuality, we were still connected to it. There was still this part of us that was it, and it was us. So everything that was within it was also without it. And every individualized aspect of it was also still connected to it. It was an amazing piece of realization when I started to think, well, everything is separately together. And that came in a lot. Everything is separately together. We think it's separate, but it's together. There is no separation, there is only oneness. The only difference is that there's levels of sentience that are pockets of sentience that have been created that use different energies. They are the given energy or it commandeers energy. And in our case, we initially are given energy to work with, a body of energy, not the physical body, but the energetic aspect of what we are. And then as we become more aware, we can start to move around that energy and move from pockets of energy to pockets of energy. But as I was working with this energy, this large sentience that was the source entity, I started to get in more feelings of a much bigger entity, the origin. And when I was in contact with this, I started to realise there's something quite important here, and I just could not get my head around what the importance was. Eventually, as I went further and further and further up the frequencies, this other entity announced itself for what it was, the origin. And I was amazed at how vast this thing felt. As I've said before, it felt like it was just everywhere, much bigger than our source entity. I felt there was an actual boundary with this that I was working with, even though it was infinitesimally large, that I felt like I could go to this level and experience everything that was part of it. But I felt there was other beings there as well, and I didn't quite understand what this meant. I thought that our God was our God, our source was our source, and there was nothing else. But when I communicated with the origin, he said, yes, well, I created these 12 other beings. These 12 other beings were there to help me evolve. And so I was gaining imagery, mental imagery of what was there, and knowingness. And so some of the information I was starting to journal became the first book, The History of God. Had difficulty in being translated from knowingness into the written word. It was amazing how I'd sit there sometimes for half an hour. How am I going to explain this? There was just knowingness that was there that I just could not translate into the English language, let alone any other language. But then I was given information based upon my own memory set. That those memories that I gained through being involved in so many different things, in my career, in my pastimes, in my experiences with other people, and that also I was fortunate enough to go into some significant depth with as well, became a communication medium, not just the spoken word, but my total incarnate vocabulary. That total incarnate vocabulary was my memories, my experiences, my emotions, my pains, my joys, my education, the languages that I'd learnt, all became part of the way that I was being communicated with. And so concepts were given me in the way that I would understand and be able to translate into a function that would be understandable by most individuals, I'd like to think, on Earth. And if I couldn't understand it the first time round, they'd try a different way. And so the source and the origin, in different linear ways when they were communicating with me, would give me concepts that I could translate into an English term. And that would be ultimately translated into a different language later, as the publisher worked with the work. But in terms of the origin, it was amazing because I got images of these entities that it created, and I couldn't understand why I was seeing these entities beyond its own area of self-awareness. What I discovered was that the origin was only starting out in its own understanding of self, and that we were all created downstream, first the source entities and then us, and then other beings by other source entities were created to help it accelerate its own evolutionary content through experience and learning. But I kept seeing these images. There's these other origins, which I mentioned previously, about how they were created in order to accelerate the origins' experience of self and learning and evolutionary content. But I was at a dichotomy. How could the origin create something that was beyond itself? Or how could there be other beings that were beyond the origin? And I initially was, how can I say it, at odds with myself. I was writing this stuff down. It was becoming part of a book. But I wasn't happy with it. And I finally resolved that, maybe these entities are the source entities. And I'd seen the source entities in my mind's eye. And I thought, okay, that's what it was. So I wrote this down and it became reasonable. But then I found out that actually this was another set of images as well. And that those other sets of images were those other 11 source entities plus ours. I was seeing not only our source entity, our creator, but the other source entities. But being able to understand and work out that there was other origins as well was confusing me. How could the absolute, in the Hindu texts, how could the absolute recreate the absolute? And that's when I found out about it couldn't recreate itself. It was a mistake in creativity. It couldn't recreate that which it is. It doesn't understand how big it is. You can't. Or it couldn't go beyond that which it is. And so the images I was getting, I started to recognise as being these other 12 origins that it created that only survived or existed for a period of time, although there's no time, but a period of events. And then they disappeared, and that energy had to be reused to create the source entities. So I was experiencing the imagery associated with these things. And when I understood that this was beyond its area of self-awareness, not beyond it, because there was no beyond it. It is it. But it only recognises its own backyard, so to speak. And it knows a bit more about the street that its own backyard is on, and a little bit less about the suburb that its street's on, where its own backyard is, and even less about the city, retrospectively speaking, and even less about the country, and even less about the planet, and even less about the solar system, and even less about the galaxy, and even less about the universal environments that it exists within, using our understanding to substitute the origin's understanding of self. Then you start to realise that actually this area of self-awareness, it still doesn't know about. It knows pockets of itself. It knows that it's got its own sentience. Its sentience grows into it. And that part of that sentient growth is the work that the source entities are working on. It's the work that we're working on with our particular source entity. And so, having recognised this, I resolved that I must talk to and have a complete set of dialogues just with the origin to help me understand more about itself and progress beyond the source books, which was me entering into dialogue, limited dialogue, clearly, with those other source entities that were created by the origin to help it understand other parts of itself in different ways, in uniquely different ways. And that's the whole point. It's got to be unique in its application of investigation of self, and the different source entities and their beings, as we do, investigated in our own different way, which is fine. It doesn't matter. There is no right and no wrong. Just investigation and evolution is what it's all about. But during the book, The Origin Speaks, which should be available around about February or March 2015, I started to understand that there's a levels of structure above those levels of structure that I understood working with the source entity and the other source entities. So I understood there was frequency as a basic building block of the multiversal structure we work within. Then there's subdimensional components of which the frequencies are attached to. And then there's full dimension, which is another structure above that. And then there's zone, which is part of the structure of our source entity, which is beyond that. So everything works in 12s. There are generally 12 frequencies associated with the subdimensional components, but there's only 3 subdimensional components to a full dimension. But there's 12 full dimensions within the multiverse. And then there's 12 zones above that. But everything is 12 within 12 within 12, apart from this 3 bit, which is a function of 12. The 3 subdimensional components are a quarter of, or 3/12 of, a full dimension. So it makes sense, it logs into it. And then there's a function above the zone. And when I talked to the origin and it started to explain its own structure, you could see that there's functions. If you think of the frequencies, subdimensional components, full dimension zones, then we start to go into another whole set until you get 12 sets of other sets of structure above that. And that's only within its area of self-awareness. And there's much more beyond that even it doesn't know yet. And so I started to understand and see with my perceptual vision these different levels. And so the levels associated with my work, the frequencies, these 408 frequencies, because the first series of frequencies, the first 12 frequencies, create the physical universe. Because the physical universe is created from the lowest of the frequencies. It needs 12 frequency bands, and it needs to have the 3 subdimensional components, and it needs to have a full dimension. So basically one full dimension creates one universal environment, the physical environment. Above that, each frequency creates a whole self-contained simultaneous universe, which is there and is part of a rigid structure. So we have this 12 times 3 times 12 gives us 396. And then we have 1 times 12 becomes 1. 1 times 3 becomes 1 times 12 becomes 1. So then we have 397 simultaneous universes. So the whole of our multiverse within our source entity is created of 408 frequency levels that creates 397 simultaneous universes. But even though it's part of the multiverse, all of our source has done is copied the structure, the lowest structure of which is part of it, that is part of the origin. And so we have everything in synchronicity. Everything is part of itself still. So even though we have these structures that we work with, it's all part of ultimately the origin. It's just that some bits of it have got individualized sentience, as we have. And so when I started to look at the bigger structure within this area of polyomniscient sentience, polyomniscient self-aware sentience, within this amorphous globe of the origin, everything starts to work on 12. Everything goes up in twelfths. Everything exists within twelfths. So if we have the multiversal structure and then the zonal structure, everything within the multiverse, all of these 12-dimensional conditions that creates this 408 actually exists in one of these zones and is repeated in 12 zones. And everything that's in 12 zones within the structure that's above that, which is part of the origin, is repeated in the next area, the continuum, and their continui. And then above that, there's like space, there's event spaces, and then there's spectra, and there's all sorts of other different levels that I can't remember right now. But everything is based within 12. Is nested 12 times within each of these things. So it all repeats itself bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I recognise that although I'm using the smallest denominator, the frequencies, to move up to and experience what's there, I can use that as a basis for moving out of, in my case, I'm lucky, I can move out of the multiversal environment that's created by our source entity into the wider environment that's created and is part of the sentience of the origin, and see these other source entities. And there's entities within these as well. There's something called the which are uncreated entities, because they were, when the source entity, not the source entity, when the origin created these other, tried to recreate itself, it assigned sentience to it already, and then it tried to reuse this energy and create these lesser beings. Well, this origin sentience didn't mix with the source entity sentience and became separated out and created smaller beings, what I'm being told to call the part of the original manifestation, which are part of the background energies of the origin. They're a fundamental part of the structure of the origin. But because they had sentience, they were reassigned sentience later, it didn't mix. It's like oil and water, so they separated out. So there's these other entities called the and it's some of these other entities that helped me move further up the frequency bands as well, and allow me to escape actually beyond the structure of the multiverse and beyond the structure that is our source entity, and move into the wider, should I say, area of polyomniscient sentient self-awareness that is the localized area of self that the source entities work within, but is actually the origin. But beyond that, the origin knows there's more. He knows there's more out there, but he's having to work on understanding itself in more detail. And that's what the source entities do. They work within themselves. They populate an area of the origin's polyomniscient sentient self-awareness, or that part that isn't quite self-aware yet. And then they go through reproducing their expansion, their creation of a multiverse, populating it with a series of entities like ourselves. And when they fully understand that area, they experience, learn and evolve and work their way up their own version of a multiversal structure, then that part of the origin is understood. That source entity has understood that part of the origin. That's also fed back on an automatic basis, and it moves on. Which is interesting, because when I was shown this methodology of moving around, the source entities move around this polyomniscient area of mostly sentient self-awareness, it explained something to me. and another penny dropped. The Hindu Vedas talk about the expansion and contraction of the multiverse, or they call it the universe, but it's the multiversal condition. And they also talk about something that is beyond God. They call it the absolute, that which is beyond God. The absolute is the origin. The expansion and contraction is when each of the different source entities, in our case our source entity, moves from one point within this area of self-awareness of the origin to another point, expands and its structure within itself, populates it with smaller versions of itself, small individualized items of sentience, and it experiences it. So there's the expansion, the breathing out. When it's all understood, because the entities have evolved up through this multiversal structure and then become one again with their creator, it contracts and moves to another point within the origin, expands again, and recreates a structure and repopulates it with those individualized aspects of itself, us again, and it expands again. So we start to see how the expansion and contraction, this breathing in and breathing out that's explained in the Hindu Vedas, is equal to what I'm seeing within the origin and how the source entities move around. And within this I finally understood, that actually we've been through, this is the third version of this, we've been through two previous expansions and contractions, and this is the third version. And actually we've only recently started this third version of expansion and contraction. We're only into this third expansion right now. And as a result of this, we're starting to understand things in a greater detail. And actually our expansion has been faster this time. The ability for evolutionary growth has been much faster this time than the previous two expansions and contractions. And so now we can start to see it in the way we're working with the Earth. We've come down the frequencies because we were allowed to have individualized free will, and we're coming up so much faster. So our evolutionary content, our accrual of evolutionary content, and our ability to work up the frequencies that create the foundation of the multiverse is accelerating much faster now than it has done in previous levels of expansion and contraction. And so, although we've only recently started, we are evolving at a rapid rate. And so the next 50 to 100 years on Earth is going to be an amazing place to be and experience, because we're going to be ascending the frequencies so fast that many of us are going to move beyond the need for this level of physicality. And it's going to be a fantastic time on Earth. People are going to be aware and awake, they're going to spontaneously awake, they're going to move beyond their level of current awakefulness, and they're going to be able to clear their karma in a single existence and move beyond the need for incarnate beingness, incarnate existence, and experience evolution without needing to become incarnate, without needing to go into this hard learning, this hard school of learning to accelerate evolution, because we'll be able to do it in the energetic as well. In reality, there is no such thing as the outside of the origin. There is no outside of the origin. It is only within itself. The only feeling of outsideness is based upon its area of self-awareness. It's mapped out certain parts of this, let's call it a sphere, of polyomniscient, sentient self-awareness, of where actually a lot of it hasn't mapped. It's allowing the source entities to map it out. That's the whole point of them being created. But it knows there's a certain level. It's got to a certain point. It's, if you liked, travelled with its own sentience to the various points on a three-dimensional compass, so to speak. And therefore it knows that there's a certain level it's been to. And it's going to understand that level and map it out totally with the use of the source entities. And itself, it's not just standing back and letting us do it for it, it's also working on itself as well. And so this level of outsideness is only based upon outside its own level of sentient self-awareness, this polyomniscient sentient self-awareness. When it's all mapped out, it'll go beyond that and go to the next set of levels that it will discover, and it will go to these various points, experience shall I say, the boundaries that it wants to set, create this matrix of framework, and then it will start to work with those and understand itself greater, and it will use the source entities to do that. And more importantly, we will become source entities in our own right, because we will have gone through all of the different processes involved with mapping out the first area of polyomniscient self-awareness, and the next areas will be so infinitesimally large in comparison to where we are right now, that we will all of us have to become source entities. We will create our own multiversal environments within our own energies. We will create our own entities within ourselves to map out this area, which is going to be so big that it's not even, we're not even capable of understanding, and the origin doesn't understand it either yet. It knows it's there. It knows there's much more beyond that, but it's going to have to set a set of boundaries and say, okay, I'm going to work with this set of boundaries right now. It's a little bit like us buying a house, and we first decorate one room. We work with that one room until we understand that one room. We strip it out bare, and then we redecorate it. When we've achieved that, then we move into the next room and redecorate that. When we've achieved that, we move into the next room and decorate that, until eventually we've decorated a whole house out. And then we think, well, hang on, why don't we work with the garden? And work with the garden and get the garden to be how we want it to be. You know, we put flowers in the garden, we remove the weeds, we might mow the lawn, we might put outhouses in the garden, we might put pergola. We work on making sure that it's a nice place to be. And when we've achieved that, we go, okay, let's work on the street that our garden and our house lives in, and we start to make that look nicer. But we can't do it ourselves, so we employ or we work with other people, our neighbours, and our neighbours work with that street as well. And so it's all about progressing beyond our personally set boundaries and understanding in minute detail those boundaries, and then we create a new set of boundaries, and then we understand and work on understanding the detail, the infinite detail of that. And when we've understood that, we then create another boundary so we can work with ourselves. And so the origin, with our help and other entities, but we will create other entities that will ultimately become source entities as well, in a number of different new conditions of boundary that will appear, start to work with the understanding of the origin, for the origin, with the origin, as ultimately smaller individualized items of the origin, which have been created by one of the creations of the origin, our source entity. Entities that come from different planets are nothing more than different vehicles we can use to experience the physical universe. They're the same as us. They're a body that we use, that some part of us has used in the past, some part of our higher self, to experience an incarnate existence. It's just they come from different parts of the physical universe, and therefore they have different form factors. Those form factors are based upon the environments, the planetary environments that they are working within and have been developed to work with and experience, learn and evolve in those instances. Some of those bodies, as with us, have worked well with their aspects, their souls, their higher selves that use them to experience these low frequency environments, and have developed technologies to help us work with these environments in a different and a more profound way. And so, as part of their evolutionary expansion, they are travelling around the physical universe, sometimes just within the galaxy we find ourselves in. Sometimes they move between galaxies, depending upon how they've evolved and how they've learned to work with the vehicles that they're using, how they can manipulate space, how they can manipulate the frequencies, how they can manipulate the dimensions to move within the multiversal environment and come back to a different place within the physical universe and experience that. So they're the same as us, basically. They're just different ways of experiencing the physical universe. Now, some of them exist on different frequency levels, and so therefore they're invisible to our human eye, because our human eye is very limited in what it can experience. It only works with 300 nanometers of frequency, from the 400 to the 700 nanometer range. That is so limiting, it's untrue. And so we can't see them with our physical eye. Somebody who is aware and awake can perceive them. And if they looked out of the window now, and tuned into the frequencies associated with the next 2 or 3 sets of frequencies, we would start to see that it's actually packed out there. There's lots going on. Now, if I expand that level of looking at higher frequencies, we start to see that there's other versions of physical body that are used that are much higher frequency. They're still physical, but they're a level of physicality that we can't comprehend yet because it's much higher frequency. To themselves, they would have some level of substance, but to us they would be classified as at best gaseous, but mostly energetic. When we look at our universe, we see huge gaps, don't we? We know, science has given us a model for the universe, and it knows, because it's captured imagery, that there is millions upon billions of galaxies within our physical universe. But there's huge gaps in space between them. They've also realised, scientists have also realised, that this universal structure is static. They thought it was expanding at first, but actually it's not, it's staying stationary, it's static. But they can't understand why it's static. So they think, well, there must be something holding it together, some structure that's holding it together. Well, there is, but that doesn't explain the gaps. There is a structure that's holding it together. But the gaps are there because the rest of the content of the physical universe is on different frequency levels. If we start to move ourselves up the frequency levels with our consciousness, we start to see the gaps being filled in. So if we went to the top frequency, the 12th frequency level, we would see that actually the physical universe is totally and fully populated to the point of it being, from a 12th frequency perspective, solid. It's totally packed. As we come down, we start to see gaps. As we come down to the 11th level, we can't see what's at the 12th level, but we can see what's in the 10th, 9th, 8th, 7th, 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd and 1st levels. As you move further down to the 10th, you can't see at the 11th and 12th, but you can see what's below that, and so forth. So if we go down to, say, the 5th level, we can't see the 6th, 7th and 8th up to the 12th, but we can see the 4th, 3rd, 2nd and 1st. And so we can see what's here, we can't see above us. But those who are just a frequency level above us can see down below and work with us. And they can move within and without where we are. But we can't see them moving within and without, because we can't see them and we can't interface with them because they're a higher frequency. And similarly, they can't see what's working with them from the higher frequencies above them. But those individuals or those beings that are working in the frequencies above them in an incarnate sense can work with what's below us and them. So the universe is packed. It's a completely, almost a solid condition. But that levels of solidity is based upon the frequencies and those aspects of the physical universe that are represented on those different frequential conditions. If I was to leave the people with something to hang their hat on, because there's an awful lot of information that I've picked up that is, to be honest, beyond a lot of people, and I struggle with it sometimes, but it's there to expand our consciousness. That's what it's there for. I would say this: be open-minded. Don't be judgmental. Accept everything and everybody as being you and you as them. When you can work with this, then the whole point of having enemies or friends disappears, because they'll all become you and you will become them. And that's a profound level of open-mindedness, because then it allows you to access other levels of consciousness. When you realise that everything is you and you're everything, and all of the individual people out there that are incarnate as well are also smaller versions of a bigger entity that created you, and you're all part of this bigger entity, and therefore that bigger entity is you and you're it, and everything around you is you and it's you, including the tables and the chairs and the clothes that we wear and everything else, then we start to have a profound understanding that we're all in oneness. This is the door we need to open. It's acceptance of everything is one. It's acceptance of everything is separately together. There is no separation. There is just levels of individuality that we've been given to allow us to experience things in a different way. When we know this, we can start to work with each other better, because we then start to realise that actually, if we're all one, then everything is me, and everything is you, and everything is them, and they're all oneness. And so we start to move away from this separation, this thought of separation, this thought of true individuality. True individuality is separateness, and there is no such thing as separateness. There is only togetherness. We may be separately together for a moment in time or event, space, but actually we're all one. And therefore that will remove the need for fighting, remove the need for wars, remove the need for, I must have this as mine and that's yours. We would share everything. We would experience everything together. We would work with everybody, making sure that we all evolve together. Nobody's in competition with each other. There's no need for competition. Everything is together. And we would be a much better place. The earth would be a much better place. The rest of the universe would be a much better place, because it would be all working for the benefit of everything rather than the benefit of the individual. Right now everything is based upon individual gain. But that's limited thinking. Expansive thinking is recognising that everything we experience is for the benefit of everything else. So why not do everything for the benefit of everybody else? Be of service to everybody else, and they'll be of service to you. And that's allowing us to have our expansive thinking. And that removes all barriers. It removes all individualised thinking, removes all separate thinking, it removes all thinking that is caused by selfishness and individuality. Recognition of one for all and all for one is what we are. Work for everybody else and they'll work for you, and there'll be no enemies, there'll be no friendships, there's only oneness. So if people want to contact me or know more about me and the work that I'm helping to broadcast, you could visit my website, which is www.guystephenneedler.com. And Guy Stephen Needler is one word, and Stevens with a V. Or you can email me on thehistoryofgod, which is all one word, at btinternet.com. And please do email me. I always respond to people who ask questions. You can also look at my books. There's the 4 books right now, which are The History of God, Beyond the Source Book 1, Beyond the Source Book 2, and of course Avoiding Karma, which is the latest book. There's another book which I'll recommend as well called Cosmos, which is also on my website. And each of these are available through my publisher, Ozark Mountain Publishing.